Hello. Um, Thank you, everyone, and for coming to this Insight Series lecture. Today we have someone very special with us. We have Professor Chandan Sharma. He is the head of the Department of Sociology at Tejpur University, and he'll be talking to us on an important topic about contemporary development discourse in the Northeast and the subsequent impact that it has had on the indigenous communities. The timing of the talk is rather poignant because we just witnessed a massive glacier landslide in Sikkim in the past couple of days, and um, it just rings the bell that what this talk will aim to do is sort of connect the dots with what has been happening vis-a-vis the development discourse in the Northeast, and how has a top-down approach actually led to this current predicament. So I'll give the abstract of this talk, and we'll formally introduce the speaker, and Anthony will be introducing the speaker. So let me begin. Northeast India is a region characterized by great geopolitical and ecological significance. It is divided into the plains and the hills and is home to many indigenous and tribal communities, which largely depend on the natural resource-based livelihoods. The practice of shifting cultivation, or jhoom, is a dominant traditional system of land use in the hill states and plays a critical role in maintaining agricultural biodiversity and providing food security. Historically, when the region came under the ambit of colonial development in the 19th century, it left a long-term impact on the natural and social landscapes of the region. After independence, especially after the early 1960s, the hills, which remained largely excluded from the process of colonial development, were also brought under the development agenda of the Indian state, as well as part of the state-making process. This social exclusion gets further accelerated in recent times under the neoliberal Indian state, leading to growing investment in infrastructure, which often undermines the traditional ecology, the land ownership systems, livelihoods, and cultures of the indigenous communities. So with that in mind, I will invite Anthony to introduce our speaker and to formally begin the series. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashish, for that. I'll just give a brief introduction of our esteemed speaker. Chandan Kumar Sharma is a professor of sociology at Tezpur University, Assam. As an academic for more than 26 years, he has been engaged in teaching, research, and institution building in different capacities in Northeast India. He was also the founder and head of the Department of Sociology at Tezpur University. Apart from being an academic, he is also engaged with various socio-political issues and civil society movements in the region. As a bilingual author, he has written and commented extensively on the pressing issues in the region, both in regional as well as national media. He has published several books and monographs, which include Culture Studies, Themes and Perspectives, Fixed Borders, Fluid Boundaries, Identity, Resources and Mobility in Northeast India, and Coronasphere, Narratives on COVID-19 from India and its neighbors. His essays have been published in journals like EPW, Sociological Bulletin, Post-Colonial Studies, and Asian Ethnicity, among many others. Professor Sharma was the founder and editor of Expressions, the e-journal of Indian Sociological Society. He did his BA from Cotton College and MA, MPhil, and PhD from the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School of Economics, Delhi. He has been a Charles Wallace Visiting Fellow at Queen's University, Belfast, United Kingdom. He has also been a visiting fellow at several Indian universities, including Delhi School of Economics and Jawaharlal Nehru University. His areas of research include development, urbanization, environment, migration, identity politics, agrarian change, and Society and Culture of the Northeast. On behalf of the Humanities and Social Science Department, I welcome Professor Chandan Sharma to IIT Gandhinagar and invite him onto the stage to deliver the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And first and foremost, let me record my thanks to the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar for extending this invitation to me and to speak on contemporary development discourse in Northeast India and how it has impact on the indigenous communities in the region. And I think this Insight series lecture is really very significant. And I again thank IIT Gandhinagar Department of Humanities and Social Sciences for hosting this. And especially also thank Dr. Ashish Khaka for coordinating this event. With these words, let me begin my talk. But before the talk, as Dr. Khaka had just mentioned, what has happened recently in Sikkim, the burst of the glacial lake and the devastation that has been eventuated after this. Many people would perhaps describe it as kind of a fury of nature, but that is, of course, nature definitely has a role, but more than that, I think we have to also question how the development initiative, the projects, and the arrogance that we have, I would say also perhaps engineering arrogance, for which have resulted in this kind of disaster. And this is, however, true for the entire Himalayan region. Some time back in the month of August, we have seen the same thing happening, of course, at a smaller scale in Himachal. 2013, we have seen the same thing, burst of the glacial lake, and which resulted in the death of thousands at this in Uttarakhand. So these are not new things, and it is not that there has not been scientific studies and there has not been warning that these kind of eventualities might take place. But unfortunately, there has been, often it seems that state doesn't bother about these things, about science, about scientific studies, and have consistently ignored such warnings and studies, and we have seen the consequences. And Northeast also, when I talk about development discourse in the Northeast, I think this is the immediate context which we have to bear in mind. What has happened in Sikkim just 2 days back. Now, before I begin my lecture, let me also take this. This is part of my lecture, of course. Indulgence from you to introduce the region, because the region Northeast is an enigma to many outside the region. And I dare say it is also an enigma to people from within the Northeast, which only speaks of the diversity, the complexity of the region. So it therefore, I think it necessary to introduce the region briefly. And it's a region which is characterized by remarkable natural and sociocultural diversity, and is traversed by 2 out of 34 global biodiversity hotspots, Himalaya and Indo-Burma. The region is geologically fragile and highly seismic, having witnessed some of the major earthquakes in the past. In 1897, there was an earthquake of the magnitude of 8.7 at the Richter scale. Another one, even more devastating, in 1950, August 1950, again of the same magnitude. And in recent times, from 1988, if I I mean, I remember that very, very clearly because I was in the college at the time. In the morning time, an earthquake of 7.3 at the Richter scale. We have another one, I think in 2016, which is 6.7. Recent in 2021, which is magnitude of 6 on the Richter scale. I mean, I'm only being very selective in pointing out to these earthquakes. There are many actually, and it talks about the volatility, the fragility of the region, and so constituted of 8 states and sharing more than 5,000 kilometers long international border. The region is geographically divided into 2 parts, hills and the plains. The region is home to many indigenous communities. While there is heated debate on the question of who is indigenous in the region, here the term is being used to refer to those communities which are popularly known as the scheduled tribe or tribals. The tribal communities are divided into the plains tribe, inhabiting mainly the Brahmaputra and the Barak valleys, and the hills tribes, inhabiting the hill regions surrounding the valleys. However, there are many tribes which inhabit both the plains as well as the hills. Each tribe has its own distinct culture, giving it a unique cultural identity. Many of these tribes are transnational or transborder in nature, which is they are found both in India as well as across its international border. The economies of all the northeastern states remain underdeveloped and primarily agrarian. A large majority of the population of the region depends on natural resource-based livelihoods. Shifting cultivation, that is zooming, is a dominant traditional system of land use in the hill states and plays a critical role in maintaining agricultural biodiversity and food security of the communities. The industrial sector in the region is quite backward. It mainly developed around tea, oil, timber, etc. in Assam during the colonial period itself. In fact, when the Assam Company dealing with tea was formed in 1839, and it happened to be the first joint stock company of India, and which was established by an act of British Parliament and was listed in London Stock Exchange. Thus, through the tea industry, Assam was connected to the global capitalist market 108 years back. Similarly, Digboi Oil Refinery, Asia's first refinery, it was set up in 1901. This way, Assam seemed to have been industrially quite advanced than many parts of the country. However, the nature of these industries and their contribution to the development of the state has been much debated. The tea industry has been criticized as an enclave economy in the sense that tea gardens were kind of islands, and which we, as I pointed out, a part of the global capitalist market, but had very little to do with the surrounding areas, surrounding valleys, and the surrounding areas of the tea gardens. And entry into the gardens were prohibited by the locals, by the outsiders, and something which remained till 1951, till the enactment of the Plantation Labor Act. But in effect, actually, this restriction on movement of outsiders still remain, although it is not legally allowed. But anyone can go and study or enter into the tea gardens, but that is not something which is encouraged. So in case of other states of the region, the industrial sector revolves mainly around timber, except Meghalaya, where mining of coal and limestone also contributes significantly to the economy of the state. However, the nature of their extraction and consequent human, social, and environmental cost has raised serious concerns in recent times. For example, the dangerous practice of red hole mining of coal in the state was banned by the National Green Tribunal in 2014 because of its unscientific and dangerous nature. Many people have lost their lives while getting into these red holes to extract coal. However, this practice still continues, and evidently under state support. Although with the region's rich natural splendor, it could have been a great destination for nature tourism. Various restrictive regulations, say for example, protected area permit, restricted area permit, inner line regulations. So these are some of the restrictions which were there and still continues to be in place. So these restrictions were there on the entry of various on the entry into various states of the region, coupled with poor infrastructure, which have stood in the way of development of the tourism sector. It is to be mentioned here that since independence of India, the northeastern region has witnessed a series of ethnic insurgencies, beginning with the Naga insurgency and subsequently spreading to the Meiteis of Manipur, Mijos of Mizoram, the Assamese, Boros, Tripuri tribes, and so on. These insurgencies have raised demands with the Indian state for various forms of self-determination. However, since the beginning, the response of the state towards these insurgencies have been rather militarist. It is to counter the Naga insurgency that the Draconian Armed Forces Special Power Act was imposed in 1958. Subsequently, as the insurgency spread to other states of the region, the act also extended to those areas, those states. The atmosphere of violence, of terror, and suffocation of the democratic polity that the insurgencies and the counterinsurgency operations have eventuated in the region are well recognized. One of the worst casualties of the insurgencies in the region has been the inter-ethnic distrust and violent conflicts. While the state has blamed the insurgents for this situation, how the policies of the state have been responsible for the rise of insurgency and the inter-ethnic conflicts has also been brought out by many scholars. Further, insurgencies also witnessed a significant demolition of the traditional social structures, especially of the Naga and the Mizo societies. As an effective tool to counter armed struggle among them, the Indian state resorted to the grouping of existing remote villages, which often involved their burning down and resettlement of the villagers in the areas with easy access, mainly along the main roads, which enhance this access to the security forces. It is this repressive and disjunctive process which is behind Mizoram becoming the most urbanized state of India. I will come to this point again. Now, historically, the northeastern region enjoyed its own centrality. It was not part of any broader landmass like northeast of something, right? It has its own centrality, its own identity. It had been a continental crossroads, and groups from different sides had crisscrossed the region or settled here. Further, in the pre-colonial times, the inhabitants in the hills and plains in the region shared a relationship of mutual dependence. There were occasional conflicts, but such conflicts were addressed using traditional mechanisms. The foothills served as strategic passages for communities engaging in trade and commerce beyond their own habitats. During the medieval period, the hill communities had links with the communities in the foothills of Assam, with whom commercial exchanges took place in border huts, the weekly market. Communities from central to western Assam had strong trade relations with Bhutan from ancient times. Now, let me highlight how this region, which had its own centrality once, became a frontier. All these changed, this relationship changed with the annexation of Assam by the British in 1826, who over a period spanning a few decades, had annexed the entire region into its territory. These annexations brought about drastic changes in the society, polity, and economy of the region with the advent of new colonial institutions and capitalist enterprises. Writing on the consequences of this on the region, political scientist Sanjeev Barua writes, I quote him, "The region's difficulties as a result of the loss of connectivity and market access following the participation of 1947 are well known. But there is also an older story of colonial geopolitics that cut the region off from its neighborhood across the eastern and northern borders. 19th century British colonial decisions to draw lines between the hills and the plains, to put barriers on trade between Bhutan and Assam, and to treat Burma as a buffer against French Indochina and China, severed the region from its traditional trade routes. The southern trails of the Silk Road, that is the southern trail of the Silk Road. While colonial rulers built railways and roads mostly to take tea, oil, coal, and other resources out of Assam, the disruption of old trade routes remained colonialism's most enduring negative legacy, unquote. It is to be noted that colonialism needed Assam's Brahmaputra Valley mainly for its tea and later petroleum, and treated much of the northeastern region as a buffer zone against Burma and China. The immediate objective of the colonialists was to establish effective military and political control over Assam Valley and then extend its control to the surrounding areas, surrounding hills, I mean. This resulted in the political reorganization of the region with the Assam Valley as its core. The new political units that came to be known as Assam incorporated the neighboring hills with new concepts of boundary and territoriality, dismantling their traditional meanings. The tea plantations came, as I mentioned, and have transformed the traditional hill plains relations. For example, the tea plantations, I mentioned about this traditional interaction between the people in the hills and the plains, and mostly the forest areas in the foothill regions served as natural commons. But once the tea plantations came up in the foothill regions, because most of the tea plantations, as you know, they need a distinct kind of landscape which receives a lot of rainfall, but where rainwater will not, be deposited, and there will be constant flow of the water. So tea plantation needed that kind of a landscape and weather, and foothills served as ideal locations for that. So most of the tea plantations, therefore, they are located in the foothill regions. But the foothill regions were also traditional route for interaction. But once the tea plantations came up, and as I have already mentioned, it was a regimented system. It was fenced. Tea gardens were fenced all around. So the traditional routes got stifled, the communication from between the hills and the plains. Not only that, in fact, the traditional interaction between villages, among villages in the plains also got disrupted, because now, tea garden coming in between two villages. So you have to take a long detour of, say, 10 kilometers to reach the other village, which perhaps was just 1 kilometer away, 2 kilometers away earlier. So it therefore also stifled the traditional kinship relations, traditional social relations in the plains as well, apart from the plain and hills relationship. And lot of conflicts that today Assam, for example, witnesses with its with other hill states. Actually, the root of that lies in this reorganization. Since early 1870s, the colonialism introduced a plethora of restrictive regulations, such as the Inner Line Permit, 1873, Outer Line Regulations Permit in 1875, ending with the provisions of Excluded Areas Act, excluded areas including Naga Hills, Lusai Hills, Northeast Frontier Tract, that is the present-day Arunachal Pradesh, and the present-day Dima Hasao district of Assam, and partially excluded areas which included Khasi, Jayantia, and Garo Hills, present-day Meghalaya, that means, and part of Mikir Hills, that is the present-day Karbi Anglong district of Assam. So, these are part of the Government of India Act of 1935, which strictly prohibited the movement of people between the hills and the plains, stifling the traditional community relations. You can see how this spatial organization, which was not there earlier, how new borders were created, how new concepts of territoriality emerged in the region. Although this was, however, ostensibly done in order to protect the people of the hills from the people of the plains. In the words of Robert Reid, who happened to be the governor of Assam from 1937 to 1942, and the author of A History of the Frontier Areas Bordering Assam, in an article called Excluded Area, he writes that this term excluded area was just a descendant of the earlier term called backward tracts, and it means that the areas enumerated as such in the Government of India excluded and partially excluded order of 1936 are excluded from the operation of the said act, that is of 1935. They are directly administered by the governor, and the elected ministry has no jurisdiction over them. Unquote. In fact, these legislations proved more enervating for the indomitable hill tribes, who now became fully dependent on the supplies facilitated by the British. Colonialism also brought about dramatic transformation in the demographic landscape in the plains of Assam, which was largely a land-abundant region when colonialists arrived. The hill areas of the region, mostly coming under the excluded areas, were spared of this, obviously because of the inner line. They were excluded areas. The expansion of the colonial dispensation, tea plantations, discovery of oil and coal, and other economic activities in Assam created great demand for manpower, which was not locally available. This led to immigration of large number of people to Assam from outside the state. This again transformed the demographic and socio-political landscape of the region within a matter of few decades. With the introduction of tea plantations in upper and central Assam in the mid-19th century, began the process of transformation of the jungles to gardens. That means tea gardens. This resulted in the usurpation of a large number of village commons or community forest land from 1850 to 1880s. With the introduction of the Bengal Forest Act of 1865, the common property resources such as forests, forest products, and grazing lands were brought under the monopoly control of the colonial regime, depriving the communities of access to these. More importantly, the region lost its own geopolitical centrality it enjoyed during the pre-colonial times, once it became a part of the British colonial India and became a frontier. During the colonial period, the Assam province, consisting of the present-day northeastern region except Manipur, Tripura, and Sikkim, was referred to as the northeastern frontier of Bengal. In 1914, some areas of the present-day Arunachal Pradesh were carved out from the then Darang and Lakhimpur district of Assam to form the Northeast Frontier Tract. After the independence of India, Northeast Frontier Tract was reorganized into what is known as Northeast Frontier Agency, NEFA, in 1951. It is to be noted that at the time of India's independence, the nomenclature of Northeast referred to undivided Assam and the princely states of Manipur and Tripura. The colonial Assam, however, went through a process of reorganization during 1963 to 1972, resulting in the formation of new states of Nagaland, Mizoram, and Meghalaya out of the erstwhile hill districts. Erstwhile NEFA was converted into a union territory with the new nomenclature of Arunachal Pradesh. However, the term Northeast got a new lease of life with the constitution of the Northeast Council in 1972, with the declared objective of securing, quote unquote, securing the balanced development of the region. Interestingly, NEC was brought under the Union Home Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, a ministry supposed to look after internal security. Here, some discussion on the establishment of the NEC and the role envisaged for it should provide a clearer perspective on the security-centric approach towards development in the region. Although created as an advisory body for the planning and development of the region, its mandate in formulating a regional plan is clear, which was clearly mentioned again when the NEC Act was amended in 2002. Further, it also wields significant influence in the respective state plans, especially those of the smaller states. The council was subsequently brought under the Ministry of Development of Northeastern Region, that is DONA, Government of India, which was established in September 2001. However, in 2018, the council was again brought under the Union Home Ministry, clearly testifying to the dominance of the security perspective in matters of development in the region. Further, simultaneous to its independence, as is well known, the partition of the Indian subcontinent considerably severed the road, water, and railway connectivity that the northeastern region had with other parts of India, and the region became landlocked. The narrow corridor through Siliguri in North Bengal, known popularly as the Chicken's Corridor, Chicken Snake, as mentioned above, remained the only physical connection of the region with the rest of India. Commenting on this, V.G. Bhargit, the senior journalist, he writes, I quote, if imperial politics distanced the Northeast from its transborder neighborhood, farther east, partition of 1947 all but physically separated the Northeast from the Indian heartland, unquote. Besides, the other historical networks also closed as the sensitivity of the region as a security frontier gained overarching importance. The creation of East Pakistan, later Bangladesh, carved out of the British India, and then the Indo-China conflict of 1962, further perpetuated this security-centric approach toward the development of the region. And the state policies in the region have also been informed by this view ever since. It is pointed out by observers that such approaches toward the region are informed by an understanding of the region as a homogeneous entity. Contesting such understanding, Udayan Mishra writes, there is no denying the geographical reality of the region, and that the region's different states share a host of common problems ranging from communication bottlenecks to drug trafficking, illegal infiltration, and insurgency. But there exist many other differences and idiosyncrasies among the various ethnic groups of the region, which can hardly be included in one rubric. While the region has been a security frontier right from the colonial rule, I think there is a critical difference between the approaches of the colonial state and the approach of the post-colonial Indian state. It is to be noted that British had no necessity of nation or state building in the region, which is why it could allow large tracts of the region to remain outside its direct administrative control as excluded or unadministered areas. However, despite the security-centric approach that the Indian state adopts towards the region, being a nation state, it necessitates that, unlike the colonial state, it expands to every part of the region, either by creating physical infrastructure or by pushing its political or cultural symbols to the frontier region, often even if at the expense of the indigenous communities. Further, although a security-centric approach dominates the state development policies toward the region, some observers, such as Jairam Ramesh in 2005 in one of his pieces he wrote, he argued that since 1980s, the region has witnessed some shift in the approach of the Indian state towards it from a security paradigm to a development paradigm, leading to a considerably increased amount of government expenditure in the infrastructure sector. While previously, Indian state was somewhat indifferent to make heavy investment in the region, close to 2000, in tune with its neoliberal policies adopted in the early 1990s, Government of India began considering heavy investment of both government and private capital in the region. This shift appears to be a result of three important factors to my mind. First, the emerging financial capability of the Indian public and private sectors. Two, the rising needs of power in the industries and cities of mainland India. And three, the growing recognition of the Indian state about the need to assert its presence in the region, especially in Arunachal Pradesh, on which China also lays its claim as its territory. The recent big push for building infrastructure such as roads, bridges, hydel projects in the region is but a manifestation of Indian state's new developmentalism, which, contrary to Ramesh, seems to be deeply informed by security concerns. Further, the development agenda of the Indian state in the region, especially in the hills, hardly seems to have taken cognizance of the socioeconomic, developmental, and environmental and demographic specificities of the indigenous communities. The declared policy of the Nehruvian state that the tribal people should develop along the lines of their own genius has long been abandoned. The rapid transformation in these communities through introduction of cash economy, expansion of trade and commerce, and various development activities has triggered an array of damaging consequences. Some scholars in recent times have argued that the new developmentalism in the region has all the bearing of a resource frontier, the key feature of which is turning the natural endowment of the region into resources and its appropriation. This implies that the northeastern region has become a provider of its resources, which have been newly disengaged from its local ownership and made available to global markets. Contextualizing Northeast as a resource frontier, Swedish anthropologist Bengt Carlson writes that nature being unbound, I quote him, rivers run across international borders, the elephants travel along ancient routes that pass from southern forest of Nepal and Bhutan through Northeast India and sometimes down to Myanmar and Bangladesh. Such unruliness of nature goes against the grain of nation state, who seek to control and assert ownership of natural resources within its respective territories, be it water or wildlife. Northeast India is a modern geographical entity, but it has retained the sense of frontier space that is not yet fully regulated or incorporated into the Indian state. Thus, plants, rivers, fossil deposits are being claimed as resources and turned into commodities for outside market, unquote. This is what the new development agenda of the Indian state in the region essentially seems to entail, which is a manifestation of the neoliberal economy that India embraced in the early 1990s. While some groups in the region have benefited from this, the overall and social and environmental costs of this agenda, which includes mining, logging, monocultural plantations, and the damming of rivers, is considerably huge. Now, allow me to present how this development agenda of the state has unfolded in the region in recent times by drawing certain examples, few examples, I mean, of few sectors, and how the indigenous communities have been affected by these, or are perhaps potentially going to be affected by these development activities. Let me start with the big hydel projects in the region, the project of the Indian state. And one consequence you have just observed in Sikkim. But there has been a long story, and there has been many protests, and many displacement also have taken place, I mean, in the region already. Because dam break is one eventuality, but the controlling of the flow of the river, changing the ecology, changing the flow, I mean, and taking over land for construction of dam, these have different kind of consequences. Definitely, dam building is not a mere engineering issue. It is a serious environmental issue. It is a sociological issue, and of course, it's a political issue. But it is seen that often the issue is reduced to being only an engineering issue, that, oh, we are taking care of it. So anyway, let me now move ahead with this. The Indian state's project of dam building in the region. So the issue has generated a lot of debate and popular resistance in the region in the last 2 decades. In August 1998, the government of India announced its policy on hydropower development, followed by 50,000 megawatt hydroelectric initiatives in May 2003. Both had their major focus on the hydroelectric potential of the Brahmaputra basin. The Northeast, especially Arunachal Pradesh, was identified as India's future powerhouse, with the GOI, Government of India, aiming to generate 633 megawatt of tidal power by building as many as 168 dams on almost all its perennial rivers. The rivers, as you know, these are Himalayan rivers and they are perennial rivers in Arunachal and entire Northeast for that matter. Although previously the popular imagination in the region was for building dams for both power and flood control, several factors changed that perception about dam building in the region. This includes their experience with several existing relatively smaller dams in the region already. Thus, once the initiative of the government toward developing big hydel projects came to the knowledge of the people, they raised their apprehension against it. Brazen violation of legally established procedures pertaining to social and environmental clearance created further agitation among the communities. Experts have also expressed serious concerns regarding building of big dams in the fragile and geologically unstable mountains of Eastern Himalayan region. In this context, it may be noted that one apparently strong logic put forth for building large dams in Arunachal Pradesh has been that because of low density of population in the state, there will be relatively small displacement of people. However, if one considers other parameters of this sparsely populated landscape, this logic of small displacement appears untenable. For example, jhum cultivation practiced by tribal communities in the state covers a large tract of land, and usurpation of such land for dam building and other allied activities will mount pressure on arable land for jhuming and other livelihood practices. This will pose serious threat not only to the livelihoods and food security of the jhum-dependent communities, but also the ecosystem as a whole. Further, the population of most of the tribes in the region is very small. For example, the total population of the Idu-Mishimi tribe today would be barely around 12,000, and at least 17 large dams have been planned in their habitat, that is the Dibang Valley. So as per the above argument of minimum displacement, even if the entire Idu-Mishimi population of 12,000 gets displaced, it will be still no displacement at all. Further, the various development projects in Arunachal Pradesh have attracted large-scale influx of migrant laborers. These being long-term projects, the migrant laborers are likely to settle in the state for long periods, which poses a major threat to the existing demographic landscape and resources in the state. While communities in Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, and Manipur have expressed serious opposition to these hydel projects, the successive governments have not seriously acknowledged the apprehension of their apprehension. Instead, it seems that the Indian state has been adamant on going ahead with this. Not only that, in utter disregard to the protesting community voices, governments taken further measures to fast-track the building of hydel dams and other infrastructure projects by doing away or relaxing the existing protective measures and undermining international conventions to which India has also been a signatory. It may be noted that the Chinese project of building 510 Jangmu Dam in Brahmaputra in Tibet, that is called Yarlong Sangpu. Brahmaputra is known as Yarlong Sangpu in Tibet, and its alleged plans to divert its water towards north has been a source of major concern in the downstream Indian states of Assam, Arunachal Pradesh for several years. Naturally, communities in the downstream areas of Northeast are alarmed as the damming of the Brahmaputra in Tibet may seriously affect their lives and livelihood by depriving the river of its water flow in a major way, leading to devastating consequences on the ecology of the downstream areas. The pro-dam voices often use the alibi of the first user's right vis-a-vis China for constructing dams in Arunachal Pradesh. They argue that by building dams on transnational rivers in Arunachal, before China does it in Tibet, India can legally deter China from building any major projects on the upstream of these rivers, which might affect India's use of water in future. Indeed, the Helsinki rules on the uses of waters of international rivers stated in 1966 that all bordering nations have a right to equitable share to the water resources that cross-national, share to water resources, except where other agreement between bordering nation exists. But these Helsinki rules, however, are still to be ratified by UN, which means that they are not yet justifiable or justiciable in the court of law. Therefore, the argument that dams in Arunachal Pradesh can be used to preempt any Chinese attempt at building dams on the Brahmaputra in the upstream, it's, I think, based on false argument. Basically, the argument is not correct. So as already mentioned, the traditional, let me now come to another very interesting aspect. Although, we saw the advent of cash crop long back in the region, tea, for example, and I have not yet discussed and I don't have the time to discuss its effect on the socio-political economic landscape of Assam. But we have experienced this long back. But now the meaning of the advent of new cash crop plantations, cultivation in the region is very different. As already mentioned, the traditional land ownership pattern in the tribal societies of the region is undergoing a rapid transformation in the last couple of decades. Various development projects like building of bridges and highways, urbanization, and aggressive expansion of cash crop plantations such as tea, rubber, palm, black pepper, cotton, ginger, etc. are contributing to this phenomenon, leading to increasing privatization and commercialization of tribal community land. As a result, in every tribal state in the region, one witnesses accumulation of large acreage of clan or community land in the hands of new tribal elites, which is not permissible under the customary law. Simultaneous to this, the state and the tribal elites are also engaged in a concerted campaign against zooming and for cash crop cultivation for some time now. All the government's argument has been that zoom is environmentally unsustainable. This campaign is aimed mainly at promoting individual ownership rights in the traditional tribal community land. It also is interesting to note that even public sector financial institutions, including banks, offer loans to tribal entrepreneurs who are engaged in cash crop cultivation against mortgage of the community land. If such entrepreneurs fail to return the loan, the land is taken over by the bank. This is totally at variance of the constitutional mandate of protecting tribal land. And interestingly, the tribal entrepreneur, he doesn't lose anything because it's community land, which is taken away, which is taken over by the banks. Evidently, the main objective behind such process is commoditizing land in tribal areas, because for zooming, for community land, government does not get any revenue. And we know how state formation takes place by sedentarizing people, sedentarizing agriculture. And it has happened historically. So the new Land Settlement Act of Arunachal Pradesh of 2019, which seeks to enable indigenous tribes of the state to lease out land to outsiders up to 66 years, poses to accentuate the process of tribal land alienation in the sensitive hill state. In other states, this process of leasing out of the community land, tribal community land, has already been quite widespread. Even if the community land formally remains with the community, the practice of control, in practice, the control of such land gets transferred to non-tribal people. This has also happened extensively in the tribal belts and blocks in the plains of Assam. One witnesses a growing number of factories, brick kilns, and other commercial enterprises apart from government projects in these areas, in the tribal belts and blocks of Assam. And many of these owners of these projects, the brick kilns, factories, the owners come from outside the region. In the background of this, the recent aggressive propaganda of the government, both center as well as the state, in Northeast India for palm oil cultivation has generated a new debate. Palm oil plantation in Mizoram started way back in 2004. Subsequently, other states such as Assam and Arunachal Pradesh have also seen palm oil cultivation in some areas. However, government's recent campaign has generated new public debate in the region. The negative implications of palm oil cultivation in Indonesia, fiasco in Mizoram, human-elephant conflict in Assam, its potential threat to biodiversity and to the fertility of the soil, etc., have triggered the public reaction against palm oil cultivation. However, the ruling governments have already targeted Northeast for this purpose to fulfill Government of India's goal under National Edible Mission Palm Oil. Huge acreage of land in Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, and Tripura has been assessed to be potential land under palm oil cultivation. Private companies will be given the land for large-scale plantations. In the tribal states where community ownership of land is legally protected, land is supposed to be handed over, which in some cases has already happened to the private companies on long-term basis. The concerned governments have been propagating how this will bring about development, undermining the apprehensions against it. In the context of such a campaign for cash crop plantation and infrastructure building in the region, the recent amendments to the Forest Conservation Act of 1980 hold special significance. The amendment to the Act can easily facilitate the clearing of vast forest areas for cash crop plantations like palm oil and for building any infrastructure. Although the Act acknowledges India's international commitments and national target of achieving net zero emission by 2070 and increasing the existing forest cover to a third of the land area, this does not seem to be a sincere pledge in the light of what we have seen. In fact, the provisions of the Forest Conservation Act of this new Act 2023 allows the diversion of forest land for roads, railway lines, for strategic linear projects of national importance and concerning national security within 100 kilometers of India's international borders or lines of control, without a forest clearance under the Forest Conservation Act 1980. Evidently, this provision is there to pave the way for building of heavy security-centric infrastructure. But this provision also puts the entire northeastern region, surrounded by international borders, under serious threat of ecological devastation. Significantly, the Mizoram Assembly has adopted a unanimous resolution opposing the Forest Conservation Act of 23 recently to protect the rights and interests of the people of Mizoram. Naga Hohos, the apex body of the different Naga tribes, have also passed a resolution to oppose the act and pushed the Nagaland State Assembly again recently, which too now has opposed the act. Now coming to the process of urbanization in the region, very briefly, the new development, maybe I can show you some of the, this is development projects in the region, the result of that. Some pictures of urbanization in the hill towns. This is from, I think, Itanagar. This is, look at the buildings precariously standing in Aizol. This August, number of buildings collapsed there in Aizol. And as I mentioned, one of the most, almost 50% of the total population of Mizoram actually lives in Aizol as a result of the policy of grouping and resettlement that I have mentioned. This is Sepa in Arunachal Pradesh. This is, I think, Shillong, and in Meghalaya, and Tura in the again the state of Meghalaya. Look at the pictures. Yeah, these are anti-dam pictures. But anyway, I'll come back to this later on. Okay. The new development agenda is also witnessed in the process of urbanization in the region. Urbanization in the region has certain distinct characteristics of its own, many urban centers being product of military-centric development. As mentioned already, urbanization in Mizoram and Nagaland has clear connection to counterinsurgency strategies against Mizo and Naga rebels. Aizawl, the capital city, I have already mentioned how 50% of state's urban population are located in Aizawl today. The second biggest town in Mizoram, that is Lunglei, comprises 10% of the total urban population of the state. The serious consequences of such overpopulation and pressure on land and other resources has been witnessed in recent times in recurrent landslides and mudslides. Scholars have also showed how militarism and capitalism are enmeshed in the process of urbanization in the city of Dimapur, the biggest city of Nagaland. Further, in Arunachal Pradesh, the military camps have been majorly responsible for development of the urban centers in the area, barring some urban centers like Itanagar. So leading to changes in the habitat of the tribal communities. They have also lost their language in many cases. Now the new generation of tribal children, they only speak Hindi. And I remember a tribe called the Bugun tribe. The new generation does not speak its language, the language at all, the Bugun language. And many communities living, next adjacent to the military camps have increasingly becoming more dependent on the military supplies. So these have different kind of social, cultural, and economic consequences. What is causing more concern in recent years is that government has emphasized the fast-tracking the project of urbanization in the region through various other schemes and projects. Many of these projects, not limited to urbanization alone, have been funded by international development and financial agencies, such as Asian Development Bank, Japan International Cooperation Agency, etc. What is clearly visible here is the imitation of the same linear model of development, including the gentrified notion of aesthetics from the global north and the national metropolises, conforming its synergy with the ideas of neoliberalism. The smart city project has been extended to several cities like Guwahati, Shillong, Aizawl, Pasighat, Itanagar, etc. While the high modernist projects ignore the environmental and social specificities of the region, the northeastern states bid for fund from the Center for Conventional Infrastructure is distinctly in keeping with the region's long history of dependency, state-led development, and center-state patron-client relationship. The emerging literature on urban studies increasingly focuses on new urban sites in frontiers, borderlands, and such other peripheral areas. These smaller, less global, and relatively more peripheral urban areas are of recent origin, but are experiencing rapid growth as it becomes part of the latest shift in the thrust of neoliberalization. Let me now come to the concluding part of the talk. Clearly, the development agenda of the state in the region hardly seems to have taken cognizance of its socioeconomic, environmental, and demographic specificities. Looking at the nature of development in the region, especially in Arunachal Pradesh, Mamang Dai, who is an eminent literature of that state, she says, this development is like an invasion. In recent times, there has been considerable emphasis on issuing land titles in the states like Arunachal Pradesh, where previously only land possession certificates were issued to the indigenous people and outsiders were not allowed to possess land in the state. This trend, however, this trend of land titling might extend to other states in the region. The main objective of such land titling, as evident from the above, is to privatize and commoditize tribal community land. This is also behind the campaign against zooming, as well as for cash crop cultivation. However, interestingly, one major reason for titling cited by the government has been to enable tribal people to mortgage land for securing loans from banks and other financial institutions for entrepreneurial activities. Already, Increasing pressure on land owing to development activities have resulted in the shortening of zoom cycles. That is the length of the gap or fallow period between two cropping phases, thus impacting the ecological viability of this farming system. The submergence of land by idle projects will further shorten the zoom cycle and enhance the pressure on the surrounding areas, thus affecting the environment and the livelihoods of zoom-dependent communities over a much larger landscape. In the last few decades, lakhs of indigenous youths have migrated out of the region for employment in other relatively more developed states and metropolises of India. Barring the educated youths, which also constitutes a significant number, most of the out-migrants are unskilled, semi-literate youths from rural areas. Unproductive agriculture, absence of livelihood opportunity, displacement due to flood, erosion, ethnic conflicts, etc. have compelled them to take up jobs such as security guards, construction workers, wage laborer in cash crop plantations, restaurant attendants, etc. in the informal sector. Many women are also engaged in the hospitality sector. The job conditions are uncertain and often dehumanizing. We also know about the kind of racist discrimination that the youths from the Northeast region do face in different parts of the country. Many of them do return after a few years, but are compelled to return again, not finding any alternative livelihood opportunities in their home states. The present trend of development may further add to the woes of these youths from the region. The present Manipur violence may also be contextualized in this form of development, which has failed to generate employment for the people. The contestations for limited resources arising out of demand for scheduled tribe status by the Métis community, in this case, has assumed the form of ethnic violence. Such demand for scheduled tribe status or more reservation in government jobs is observed among several other communities in the region. It may be noted here that Government of India adopted its look-is policy in early 1990s, emphasizing greater engagement with the countries of Southeast Asia. Subsequently, in 2014, the policy was rechristened as the Act-East policy. The Northeast, on account of its geopolitical proximity as well as close historical ties with the Southeast Asia, was touted to become a center stage in these new engagement. There have been animated public debates and discussions in the region about the possibilities and pitfalls of this policy, whether it will transform the region into a hub of economic activities or the region will be reduced merely to a corridor for the flow of resources. No matter what the argument are for and against the policy, it is evident that today the region is increasingly becoming a resource frontier. In an article, myself and my co-author, Rashmi Banerjee, we argue, I quote, that this becoming transformation into a resource frontier of the transformation of the region into a resource frontier has transformed and redefined the environmental, economic, and developmental interest in the region. Resource mobilization transforms spaces and relationships that people maintain to these spaces. It results in economic gain for some, often combined with deprivation of many other, unquote. While the region's historical connectivity with the land and commodities beyond its present-day international border has been often underplayed, the contemporary statist discourse is, I quote again, replete with rhetoric where Northeast India is being projected as a door to Southeast Asia and as a region which can contribute significantly towards the economic development of the country by facilitating the critical linkage between the Indian mainland and the economically prosperous Southeast Asia, unquote. The importance of development of the Northeastern region can hardly be overemphasized. And the positive intervention of the state is a sine qua non in this. However, the contemporary development discourse in the region poses to impoverish its communities, especially the indigenous communities, by dispossessing them of their access to resources and facilitating their extraction by economic forces from outside. This is at the root of apprehension and resistance of the local communities across the region against the process of development in recent times. They want development, but not at the expense of themselves. They want such development in which they are equal stakeholders, which respects the social, cultural, and environmental specificities of the region, and which is sustainable in nature. Indian state can indeed realize such a vision of development through more creative and democratic dialogue with the communities in the region and take initiative towards redefining its conventional core frontier relationship with the latter. I conclude with that, and thank you very much for your patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chandan, for that very engaging and dense assessment of the development situation. The reason why we also started this series was to engage with issues that affect Indigenous peoples as well as the development projects that have affected them. And I think your talk really puts it into a correct framing. I just had one question from my side before we open up the floor to the audience. So from your speech, it is clear that there is no break in the colonial pattern of development and the post-colonial treatment of the region. The British created the Northeast as a frontier agency vis-a-vis China and current day Burma, and the Indian state after 1947 does not seem to budge from this creation. Rather, it wants to solidify this creation through its developmental project. So my question is that in terms of the stakeholders who are part of this process, the Indigenous people, as well as the larger populace of, I mean, the broader social groups in that region, how do you see this in engagement and I would say resistance to this sort of a top-down external approach, which is very alien to their own what we in sociology call as the worldview, their worldview of their own communities, their interaction with several other fellow tribal communities. So when this has a history of 100 to 200 years, when this creation of this frontier region has been done for the last 100 years, how has the process of engagement, or I would say resistance, also taken place from the community side?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. First, so far as the engagement of the colonial state and the post-colonial states engagement in the region is concerned, one thing I mentioned is that I see a break there. Although in many ways they might look the same, but see, Indian state, I mean, colonial state could afford to keep certain areas as buffer, as unadministered areas. They had, however, full control over this. They created certain mechanisms which allowed them to have control over the hill tribes, which they otherwise could not control. I mean, militarily or administratively, but these regulations, these mechanisms actually compel the hill tribes, especially in Arunachal. We have seen how they finally had to give in to the pressure of the colonial administration. But still, these areas are not under, excluded areas, right? Unadministered areas. But post-colonial state cannot afford to keep areas that are unadministered. Nation state has to have full control over all the areas within its jurisdiction. And that is why I mentioned in my, lecture, it is so important for the Indian state to stake its claim and commoditize everything in the region. So that is therefore a significant break. And you are also in the process of state making or nation building. However you look at it, it's a different issue. Some people would call it nation building, but there are scholars who would say that, this kind of the development activities, the developmentalism that the state has undertaken in the region will not result in, it is only state making, it will not lead to nation building. So there is also an argument like that. Now, coming to the community's engagement or resistance, you see, again, community, if we say, we see resistance, no doubt about that. But there is also a class dimension. It is difficult to say that everybody are, voicing the same arguments, or their narratives are the same. And there you will find there are many people in the region for whom perhaps hydroelectric projects will give electricity, bring about development, and so on and so forth. But local communities, and also who are more environmentally sensitive, and perhaps they who can foresee the effect of, or cumulative effect of dam building in the region, they are raising their voice against it. Because you have raised this question, in order to highlight this, let me make one mention of an example of, say, Bogeybill Bridge, which is the longest rail-cum-road bridge in India, almost 5 kilometers width, over Brahmaputra, connecting north and south bank, Dhemaji and Lakhimpur. Okay, so and I conducted field studies, and my students have also conducted field study. And from 2007, I have conducted field study there, and I have written on it. And say on the Dhemaji side, where the bridge connects, I think the picture is here, the bridge. Yeah, I think this is back, right? Only one picture came, I think. The dumping of the boulders is there. But oh yeah, so you see on the Dhemaji side of the bridge, that's the habitat of the Missing community. Now the Missing community, they are a riverine community. They live on the river banks. That is their normal habitat, and they do not have tenurial document in ownership of land. Tenurial document of ownership of land is not there with them, right? And they also keep shifting places. A place gets flooded, then they will shift to some other area like that. Now, this project, when it came up, actually it was inaugurated by Prime Minister Deve Gowda in 1997, January 1997. But only in 2002, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the Prime Minister, the building process started, or construction process started. But to speak the truth, then the land acquisition, etc., started in 2004, and actual process of construction started in 2011. Now, in 2004, when land acquisition was taking place, because land has to be acquired for dumping of the boulders. See, the river in that area riverbed was 10 kilometers width. So, and that would have been an extensive affair to construct a building from an economic point of view, from the point of view of the builder of the bridge, right? So what they did from both sides of the river, they filled the riverbed with boulders and reduced. Therefore, the bridge is now 5 kilometers long, right? Still, it is the longest rail-cum-road bridge in India. So now, where the boulders are to be dumped, they need land. So they went to the Missing community, villagers there, for asking for land to give on lease, rent. They were not agreeing because they do their, farming there. So they were not agreeing, and they also thought that the entire area will become a different place altogether, and that will affect their habitat. But then somehow they were convinced, and in this, of course, certain local, middlemen were also involved, and they were told that they will get rent for dumping of boulders on their land. So when they went to collect rent at the end of the month there, they were asked for the patta, that's tenurial document of ownership of land. But most of them didn't have patta. Their forefathers owned this land. They got this land from the forefathers. So what happened? They did not, nobody, I mean, very few of them got rent and other compensations. For other land, it was government land, according to government. It was government land, it cannot be their private land, right? But for them, it was community land. So what happened to this community? And I have seen how they got displaced. Many of them became, farmers became wage laborers. They became thela pullers, rickshaw pullers. And after coming of the bridge, the ferrying service got disrupted. So there was no ferrying service, right? The BG Ghat, you can see where a lot of local people found, local people found, found employment, was also gone. So it was a serious situation, loss of livelihood and rhythm of life. Their economy was tottering. So many people started moving out, and leaving the women behind. Out migration started from there. And I mean, and local people will tell you how, their cultural festivals, social life, everything got disrupted because of this. Because most of the time of the year, the youth are not there in the village. Now, the same bridge, however, is a metaphor of development for Assam. For everybody in Assam, typical middle class, for example, it's a metaphor of development. And it is not that this bridge was not required. This bridge was very much needed, and there was a public demand for this bridge. And in fact, to 1985 Assam Accord, it was mentioned there. On the strength of the Assam Accord, only this bridge was built later on. But how the bridge came up, and definitely the bridge connected people from two banks. Their journey time became much less, and they were saved of much of the trouble, suffering they had to undergo earlier. So no doubt about that, and connected Assam and Arunachal in a much better way. So definitely the bridge is of tremendous, it has tremendous socioeconomic significance, no doubt about that. But look at the cost that the community had to pay. And I would say many people in Assam would be oblivious to this. For them, this is not important because it's a metaphor of development. Again, see how things are connected. Look at where from these boulders were extracted. The boulders were extracted from hills and the existing riverbeds. You can imagine the environmental consequences of such boulder extraction at this level. Brahmaputra is a mighty river, and filling the river and the riverbed with boulders extracted from hills and riverbeds. You can just imagine the kind of adverse impact of such actions that might have. So you see, on the one hand, definitely it is it's a bit much development, much needed development, but the consequence could have been easily avoided had they not looked for economic benefits, benefit analysis, but if they looked for, or analyzed the socioeconomic cost of it, look for social cost-benefit analysis, perhaps the price that we are having to pay now would have been saved. So that is so what kind of development? I said not this kind of development. This could have been avoided. This was my view. And here how communities, in terms of class, in Guwahati, it's a great thing. People who have car, who needed this bridge, this is a great thing, of course. But nobody thinks about the local communities, the tribal people who didn't have patta, land patta, and their land, habitat, livelihood, all gone. So I'm just trying to contextualize how things happen there in the lower east. And such examples may be multiplied. This is one example.
I'll open the questions to the audience? Okay. If people have questions, you may please raise their hand. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Sharma, for the wonderful talk. I'm a bit familiar with the Dibang Valley situation. So what is happening is that I understand what you're saying. It's a top-down approach of development. The state-led development is very unjust to the indigenous communities. But in some places like Dibang Valley, what is also happening is that not everyone is against. No. I think I understand what you're saying, but the picture is even more complex than that, because there are members within the community who have the privilege to negotiate to get a bigger package. For example, in the NHPC resistance, the people who participated in the resistance movement, when I went for the field work, they were all waiting for the compensation. Now they have got compensation, and now they are fighting for bigger compensation. And there are communities who were promised compensation, they didn't find it. So what I'm trying to say that the idea of stated development, there are partners within the communities who are saying that in some, for example, in small communities, the damage is much higher. But in communities with just smaller in number, the benefits are higher because the per head compensation is much heavier. It's very hard to resist. So there are partners who are pushing this form of development. Of course, there are people who are resistant, but that is also becoming very stronger. I think it's good to see that, I'm not saying good to see that, what I'm trying to say is there are a group of fence-sitters, and they become like the people who are pro-dam, they go and ask them to come to this camp. So there are these multiple layers within the communities who are fighting among themselves, fighting the state sometimes, but also they are partnering with what you can call this middlemen, Marwadis, who are helping them in building malls and, so I'm trying to understand these other forms of partnership that is happening, which we don't get to, talk about, rather than looking at development from a very, state-led and also anti-poor development. So is there some other way of understanding this development stories, what I'm trying to understand? Thank you.
Observation, and which actually I try to also, discuss in my presentation. And when I talk about the middleman, the tribal elites, and because see, the development agencies and the state also creates its own stakeholders. And this is an old game; it's not new. And I know what what you are saying, and this compensation, and what they are doing with this compensation money, all engaged in primitive accumulation, buying large, big luxury cars and stuff and houses. But ultimately the question is, what about the community? We are, as outsider, we are also concerned about the community. We are concerned about the preservation of the landscape, because some people might get the benefit. These are small communities, of course. Some of the communities are very small. But what will happen ultimately? Even Itanagar is facing the kind of, what should I say? I had some pictures of landslides there. Beautiful roads. Every year, however, you'll see how they are coming in. Every year. Okay? And the Itanagar. So in fact, yeah, this is in Itanagar. So, even the, so for the anti-dam movement is concerned, we know there are so many from within the societies, communities in Arunachal. In fact, the political leaders are saying that, and there was this case of change of money up front at that time when MOUs were signed, and which came in the public. And many ministers today and political leaders, not only there in other states also, see, the argument is that there is nothing called community land. All land belongs to the state. This is the argument. They are all tribal elites, but they would say that there is nothing called community land. All land belongs to the state. Now, what happens when land belongs to the community? Then the process of negotiation is very difficult and different. because you have to negotiate with the community for leasing out land or buying of land, taking over land. But if land belongs to the state, then you can immediately, lease out or hand over the land to the developers. So this has been going on, and in other states as well. But Arunachal is in a different scale because of the kind of, it's a big state, and there are too many development projects going on in the state because of different reasons. Of course, it is a security-wise also very sensitive. Dam building, road building. So no surprise that there are people who are new stakeholders. Some people benefit more from the existing political economy. Some people are at the receiving end. But yes, these are the nuances, definitely. But essentially, what is happening, that is what I try to actually highlight.
Hello, sir. I'm Manikandan, MA first year student. So thanks for the very detailed talk. I also wanted to put something very important about I feel. It's not a question rather than an emotion also. So what I believe is if I trace back to the history, the colonial cartography of, reordering the space, the landscape, not considering the cultural boundaries, is one form of violence that had happened very long back, probably some 200 years ago or from 200 years ago. With that, we have the formation of, you touched upon the plantation, plantation workers, their migration happened there, the settlement, and then later in the post-colonial period, maybe also had the same continuing. We started with the development projects, and then we also came till the sustainable development projects, what we are speaking, but we see here what is sustainable here. From yesterday, before yesterday, the Sikkim thing happened. With this urgency, this is a very emergency situation or very urgent situation. This is not only with regard to, definitely it is more significant in the northeastern region of this country, but also I feel it is happening in other places within India and, Brazil and other, where the indigenous people of the, of the land is also, of course, we cannot distinguish between land and people. What I feel is, are we not in a situation where, I'll also take another point where the state coming up with, trans-border projects like BIMSTECs, connecting Southeast Asia with the Indian landscape. So is there a sense of a strong political, environmental justice movement that is very required at this point of time, which northeastern region, having witnessed so much of violence in terms of trauma, memories, as well as the physical violence that is happening, racial cleansing, and I don't know if I'm right to use that word. Don't we think this is a time for this country to have a strong, political, environmental justice movement, or, political party that represents, because we see that Green Party in Germany, France coming up there, and, they are the first developed nations, and we as a developing country looking for, space in the global order. So is that not the right time, where we also have the we also have the existing political parties and other things, but don't we see that there is an emergency for this? Thank you.
Hello. So no, I totally agree to what you are saying, and it is also not that there has not been such movement, and perhaps you are talking for a more stronger movement. And in fact, governments have also signed international mandates, right? And they're actually legally obligated that way. I mean, not legally, but they have their own obligation to, address this situation that we are facing today, climate change, for example, global warming. And what happens is that I have seen in case of Northeast, how government in the power, they support them as soon as they go out of power. Or if they are in the opposition, they oppose them. For example, the party which is in power today, they oppose big dams in Arunachal and entire region. But once they came to power, they are also arguing for. They're not arguing. They're trying to frustrate the dam building and other infrastructure development in the region. So how you make them answerable, accountable. This is also very important. I think it also perhaps speaks of the weakness of our democratic polity. So it's a very difficult question. But all over the world, there is on the one hand, we are facing global warming, such kind of destruction everywhere. Developed countries are tottering at the onslaught of such, cataclysmic events, America, Europe. But we have not yet been able to address this issue really effectively. Because there is always a kind of, competition, growth story. You cannot decelerate. You have to, this is the capitalist story. You have to keep growing. Then there is the story, the difference between the developed and the developing countries. So developing countries now cannot afford to stop, because in order to keep pace with or to become developed, you have to be, growing. So how do we address these issues? Actually, this is definitely a global issue. But at the same time, how we can make our political parties more accountable. Also, I think it's a very important question that we have to address. I don't know how, but because in Assam, for example, she knows, in Arunachal also, there is very strong anti-dam movement. But there is a limit to everything. There are so many issues. Communities cannot engage itself in all the issues, right? They do not have the time. So there is a kind of, people are exhausted. But the state also has to understand what are the concerns, right? So if they do not, then it becomes very difficult. I don't know how you make accountable, the state accountable. What to say? I'm a little disappointed with what has happened. And to the movement, she knows that there is hardly any strong movement now, anti-dam movement. But I don't know, the Sikkim thing might, no, it's not, nothing will happen. They are all divided.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the talk. I'm Trishita. I'm working as a research assistant here. My concern comes from, I don't know whether I'll put it as a question or an opinion, but my concern comes from the fact of what is the alternative when we talk about developmental discourse. And when I try to think about it, I feel, can we trickle down into looking at the everydayness of the state in impact on community, and community has obviously a intersectional subjects, right? So as like authors like in feminist political ecology, like emergent ecology is a kind of a concept, or Anna Singh, for example, talk about how with all this Anthropocene or changing ecological dynamics, there is also a coping mechanism happening, which reflect how the worldview and the practices are emerging in a different forms, maybe. So I feel in the context of the Northeast, the discourses that is being written about in popular academic forum there is a, I don't know, like my limited, and from my limited understanding, I feel that there is a lack of focus given on looking at this micro level aspects of everydayness. I think will that bring the alternative of looking at development aspiration, because there is a aspiration. It can't be a dichotomous thing, right? Like development and so yeah, I mean, this is what I wanted. Thank you.
No, thank you. See, we are here not talking against development per se. We are talking or speaking against the kind of nature of development that is taking place. And when, the, consequences of some events are so big, so large, that it's very difficult to talk about the small things. The effect is of overarching nature. So, can a community cope with such developments, such events at their own level? It is not possible. I have seen how traditional knowledge system coping methods have started failing now in many communities. They have, how they used to, they could forecast certain things before. Now they cannot, because the entire parameters have changed. So these issues, therefore, I find, of course, community level engagement is very important. But here we are talking about events which are of overarching nature. Unless we address these issues at that level, at the global level, for example, and also at a local level, we need this synergy, or regional level, national level. So we have to address this question at different levels. But because these are big issues, right? So how the community, say, for example, what has happened in for example, Sikkim, how the local communities, small communities cope with that? So many villages, army camps, I mean, everything have been swept away. What is unfortunate is that these kind of glacial outbursts have been predicted. And the recent studies I have just gone through yesterday, that there are perhaps 19 such glaciers which are expanding because of course, global warming. So the water retention capacity of these lakes is now becoming less and less. I mean, so this is the optimum. So Assam and Arunachal Pradesh are now, they face the major threat of these glaciers. So anything can happen in the coming months. Not immediately, because this is now anyway, winter is coming. But next summer, you never know. I think showed you the picture of Haflong. This is, of course, nothing to do with it, yeah, but look at one. Back, really. 2022, Haflong, beautiful hill city in Assam's Dima Hasao district. The kind of devastation that took place there. See, the entire railway station, the entire rail, I mean, everything was just swept away by this mudslide. So communities are at a loss. I mean, they cannot handle these things at their level. No chance.
Thank you very much for the talk. And I think, we covered in the other questions a lot of the intricacies of the development, story, and the struggles and the, consequences. So I wanted to take a little bit of a different thing that you mentioned, which is the construction of the region. You mentioned it that, at the beginning it was, you talked about how it was like almost like a center, a crossroads for cross-cultural exchange, and then it was constructed as a frontier, by British, and now the Indian state also constructs it as a frontier. All the policies like Look East also see it as very utilitarian kind of corridor passing through. Now, and then at the end, you mentioned that one of the ways in which we get out of this is through the center periphery discourse. Now, the construction of Northeast itself, idea of Northeast, as you mentioned, historically comes out of a development framework in a sense, right? This development, these groups say like, okay, the Northeast of India needs to be developed, this issue needs to be, and so this is also feeding into this periphery idea, frontier idea, feeds into this developmental thing in a way. So how shall we, how can we, if people say are doing research, people from the region or people out of the region, reimagine this idea of Northeast? Like, how do you, you don't even, maybe we shouldn't even call it Northeast of India anymore if we take it seriously as trying to reconfigure center periphery relation, trying to get out of this frontier. So how should we imagine that the space, in a sense, as a first step to get out of this, to think about differently the region?
So region formation, as you know, has its own history. And we have different regions in India. There is no problem with region. We have South India, we have North India, So there is no problem. Problem happens, I mean, when a region becomes a periphery, then you need certain policies, and where it becomes a periphery and what kind of periphery it is. In a way, Kerala is also periphery. In a way, Punjab is also a periphery. In the periphery, but Northeast is a different kind of periphery, right? So it is a frontier. And so policies for the frontier, and it's a buffer as well. As you know, again, Indo-China, it has been a buffer traditionally. So what happens is that policies of development always, or any policies for that matter, towards a frontier is different from that of the mainland. Now, how do we change? Actually, very interestingly, while Northeast is being understood in a homogeneous sense by many people outside, and they have a very homogeneous idea of the people and the land, culture, right? And that is not so. And in the very beginning, I mentioned, but the concept has gone to such a deep level in our mind also that it's very difficult to get out of this. But at the same time, it is important to understand the region has its own heterogeneities. The region had its own centrality. Because because what happens now, we look at the region through the lens of Indian nation state. Northeast part of Northeast India. So that already immediately peripheralizes the region. So, if we understand the inner heterogeneities and the centrality of the region on its own, that will take time. And I think a lot of scholars, they're writing now that we see now actually address this question. And but popular perception is very different. And second, the state policies also, but then state policies also have to change. But whether that will change, it's a question I can't answer. Because the region definitely has its own strategic geopolitical importance and different kind of significance it has. And so whether the region has to live with that or Indian state will think about, but Indian state definitely talks about it, that the region will become the core of its Look East policy. But we now know that little is happening actually through the land routes. Everything happening from, say, Calcutta or Chennai. The Look East policy actually region has not been benefited, or region has not been at any stage actually that level of engagement that was expected from the region, or thought that region would be engaged in this, has not happened. Even now, actually, Northeast figures barely in the Lucas policy. That is what I have seen. Every trade, commerce, everything actually, everything has happened through Calcutta port or Chennai, like that. Nothing has happened through Northeast. So therefore, whether the state policy change, and if it changes at all, then when, it's a very difficult question to answer. But at the level of scholars, definitely we can reorient ourselves as to how to understand the region, abandoning the traditional prism that we have always fall back on.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for the talk. As far as development in Northeast, like we were discussing in the talk, so there's certainly an entanglement which is visible between, say, disciplines like development studies and security studies. The larger narratives which have emerged is like development somewhere is a source of non-traditional security threat, whereas it's also perceived as a tool which can help a state battle its traditional security threats. So do you think it's actually able to battle traditional security threats? Is it effective in doing so? Or it's just like a course which is like created with a particular purpose?
So far the security threat is concerned, the traditional security threat was from China. But now we have these development in the region we have seen in the last few decades has created new threats, and which are no less dangerous or no less challenging than the threat which actually have been talking about, or which we try to encounter or negotiate by these development activities. So I personally see, I mean, howsoever, whatever you do, in case of this kind of conflicts that we, perhaps when we talk about, countries are anyway going to be affected economically, physically, whatever way. And Northeast is very near. I wrote an article long back. If some of these dams explode, then what will happen? Anything can happen in case of these kind of conflicts. So that is even more dangerous. We are trying to stake claim over that land, but that land belongs to us. No problem with that. But if that kind of an eventuality happens, that thing happened, then what will happen to the community in the downstream? These are, therefore, I think what is the best way to counter this kind of threat is to have better dialogue with our neighbors. And so that we do not suffer this kind of, and also you see every year how much money we invest, how much capital we invest, and how much capital has just gone awash. This is also to be taken into account. I don't know whether this makes any difference or not. Or for example, the dam in, Sikkim broke. And now this talk of rebuilding this dam. And they are saying that, oh, it will cost them 1,000 crore rupees or something. So there is no, coming down from that. So it seems the construction itself is important more than any other thing. You build infrastructure. So it seems that there is an obsession with infrastructure building. And so the growth story continues. Perhaps. But so far as security is concerned, I think dialogue with neighbor is more important. Then, of course, infrastructure is important, but infrastructure needs to be sustainable. If you build unsustainable infrastructure, then it will not help us. Even in the wake of a conflict, something happens, because you see, the land, in western say Arunachal, East West coming and all that. It's so landslide prone area, and it can happen anytime especially during the rainy season. So how these help when you need to mobilize, for example, security forces? I am not a security expert, and I should not discuss this, but these are commonsensical questions that we have. People have, right? So I think therefore dialogue is important, not with the community, but also with our neighboring countries, because this kind of competition will not keep us in good state.
Hello, sir. My name is Preet. I'm a first year MSc student. Thank you for such an insightful talk. My question was actually revolved around the same theme, that traditional and non-traditional threats. However, I just wanted to ask that, like, for there's development that is actually marginalizing the indigenous population, while at the same time there are security threats. So for the community living in the Northeast, how do they basically balance such kind of, developmental issues as well as security threats? As you mentioned that within the community, there's a class level of different of opinions. So on the basis of that, what is the perception? How is the different level of class and caste balances such kind of ideas, such kind of threats, basically?
If I understood you correctly, you see, communities are not, informed of these security threats, etc. They do not discuss. In the normal parlance, this security threat is hardly discussed. These are basically threat perception of the state, and that is what informs its development policies. Communities, of course, they would definitely want a strong force, and who should protect our geographical territory, right? But on the day-to-day parlance, that is not something a concern for them. They need development, sustainable, proper development, but not at the cost of their own habitat, livelihood, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the balancing question with security does not arise, because that's a government concern, state concern. But at the same time, all people in the border areas, you see, they do not want conflict with neighbors, whether it is in the West or in the East, because in such an eventuality, they will be at the receiving end, right? So I think, yeah, that's it.
So, sir, you've talked about how the reorganization of the hills and valleys in Assam through tea plantations in the colonial period, and so we can understand how an ethnic identity is magnified and reinforced through claims of natural resources, and that these claims, these ethnic identities have their own demands through formation. It has resulted in the formation of insurgent groups, etc. So you have talked about the reorganization of hills and so through that we can understand that how an ethnic identity is magnified and reinforced through claims to natural resources, and that these ethnic identities have their own demands through the formation of insurgent groups, etc. So we can understand that the moment their land has been defined or categorized as prime areas of natural resources. It has changed their relationship with their land, between communities, and even with their ethnic identity within the state. So how can we articulate, there's these respective claims of these different ethnic identities? And also, uh, I, I have another question. Yeah, we have these colonial records that uh, these hill tribes in the colonial records that these they were often left untouched. The British government, they often uh, uh, they were they considered them as savages, and they said it's better for them to leave them alone. So they mostly remain in the valley areas. So at what point has their lands become, the lands of these tribals become, prospects as resource rich hubs? So that's at, at what point has their land become prospects as resource rich hubs? How at what point how are they classified as resource rich hubs, and the eventual British
So far the hill tribes are concerned, throughout the colonial period, most of these areas were unadministered areas. Meghalaya was, of course, partially excluded areas. The other areas remain unexcluded, okay, and unadministered, so to say. But it doesn't mean that they say, for example, Kohima, Kohima also had British presence, right? But they generally would not interfere in the tribal affairs. Okay, so it was like that. So it was, they were trying to minimum control, some kind of control, and because it was, these areas were part of their zone of influence. That is what they would call these areas, zone of influence. And so have I addressed your second part? Oh. But that doesn't mean that British didn't have any control, not exactly control. Control they had, because as I said, they introduced the new lines, etc. There is a system called POSA system, and through which actually they control the Nishi people, earlier known as Dafalas. They are known as Nishis. So they, and also Abors, Adis. There was this Anglo-Aber war, and of Arunachal, and these tribes were they could not be vanquished through military expeditions. So British had to resort to different tactics, tactics of drawing this inner line and outer line. People from hills could not come beyond an outer line, and people from the plains could not go beyond the inner line, right? And so people were therefore compelled to give in to the British demands. But British also very intelligently continued the pre-colonial POSA system, which means that people from the valleys will come down to the plains to collect certain varietals they need in the hills. And the local communities in the foothills would, provide these, varietals to the communities from the hills. And they would be spared of any kind of trouble, the people in the foothills. So this is how the British, so in the process, British also, without occupying the hills physically, extended their control. So it remained the hills in Arunachal. Of course, much of it was still beyond their even zone of influence. But British definitely had some kind of control over the tribal people there. But the first part was, your question was, I think, related to space and identity, right? And yes, colonial state, of course, it not only reorganized the territory by giving a sense of space to every identity. You see, what the colonial state did. Before colonialism came, there was the concept of soft boundary, some kind of boundary of my habitat and what is its difference with others' habitat, other communities' habitat was definitely there. But these boundaries were soft boundaries. And colonialism also, during colonialism also, their boundaries were still soft. Even then, the concept of inner line, outer line, etc., they were precursors to present-day hard boundaries. So now, once the states are separated, that is why foothill conflicts take place, no? So many of the states were carved out of Assam, for example, colonial Assam. Earlier, when the boundaries were same, okay, there was a sense of boundary. This is hill, this is plain. But the some kind of communication was also there. But once, say, these became separate states, you have to draw different lines, and state must have full control over its territory. Who will collect the revenue? Say, for example, something happens, who will control the law and order? So every state has to have full control over its territory. So that is how boundaries get harder. So we today have only hard boundaries. There are no soft boundaries, right? That is one. So this is Arunachal, this is Assam, this is Meghalaya. That one kind of identity. The other identity is, you see, British created the identity of hill tribes and plain tribes, so to say. But say we also know, however, there are many tribes which are both in the hills as well as in the plains, right? For example, the Dimasas. Dimasas are recognized as a hill tribe. But we find large number of Dimasas in the Assam Valley. Similarly, the Karbis, right? So then again, they will also fixate communities with certain habitat and certain hills. And in Robert Reid, in his book, written it, the whole British policy about this in his the history of frontier areas bordering Assam. Very interesting history. And in fact, Nagas of, say, for example, Eastern Nagaland would be considered degraded type, not their habitat proper, something like that. So, they try to fixate each and every community to a particular habitat, particular area, which means that unlike, they had very soft and flexible idea of their own habitat. But now that got fixated with a particular area. And that gave rise to, I think, in an essay which I wrote long time back, ethnicization of space in Northeast India. How ethnic community looked at a particular space as if it exclusively belongs to them, ignoring the fact that communities were mobile. It is not that only one community lived in a particular area. There had been other communities also, right? But this idea has been totally abandoned now. And I think this, and that has led to this trend of ethnicization of space. Every space is ethnicized. So homeland politics, this is my homeland, and I have to have full control over it. I am the, actual inheritor of this land. So I think this is also it's not a sustainable idea. I think, but this is a colonial legacy, and which we have not been able to negotiate even today. And in fact, the problem is getting worse and worse.
So I think in interest of time, I know there are questions, but I think we can continue the questions after the formal talk is over.